Thanks very much, Philip. Well, it's very good to be here. And I've been asked to speak about the subject of work, and it seems a not inappropriate subject to think about over breakfast. Most of you, and perhaps even I, have half a mind to the things that you've got to do in the rest of the day. And for most of us, that'll be some kind of work, whether paid or unpaid, whether in the home or outside of it. Work just seems to fill up so much of our time. Now, the funny thing about work is that like so many things, like so many good things of God's creation tainted by the fall, we're often just disappointed by it. It seems as if it should be fulfilling and interesting, and oftentimes it's at best just pretty dull and sometimes downright difficult. Of course, we all have our triumphs, our moments when we really see the value in what we do, and I'm lucky because of the kind of work that I do in the university means that I have those moments perhaps more than many. But it's a very rare soul who wouldn't at least sometimes say over breakfast that they'd rather not be setting out for work at all, but taking a day at the beach, or better yet, in bed. So the question is, if work is good, if we were made to tend God's garden, and if as Christians we're to recover something of the sense that it's good, how should we approach it? What should it look like to be specifically a Christian at work? By what principles should we set out to do what we do each day, and to do it in the home or the office, in the factory or school or university? Now, Crusaders is an effective ministry precisely because it works on the power of mentoring. Many a camper finds a powerful role model in their Crusader leader. Many a young person in a school finds a powerful mentor in an older student, a role model that inspires for years to come. Well, I'm lucky in that I've had some very valuable mentors in my work life, but none more than a godly Christian man whose attitude to his work still challenges me to think about what it might mean to live for God in that context. And I want to tell you a little bit about him. Well, my last job at Oxford was as head of the Social Sciences Division. The university is divided in 4, and I looked after one of those quarters and was part of the small team that led the university as a whole. It was a really interesting job. But my predecessor in the role was a man called Donald Hay, and he's the mentor that I admired so much. Interestingly, he was also a great mentor to the former Archbishop of Sydney when he was a curate at St Andrews, Oxford. In a familiar passage in Colossians, Paul says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for men." And that was the attitude of my mentor, Donald. It was an attitude that visibly altered the way in which he undertook his work. And that meant that those around him were impressed by a qualitative difference in his leadership. Indeed, even a confirmed atheist I know remarked on the difference that knowing God seemed to make to him and to his work relationships. Donald worked for the Lord and not for men, and it showed in the way that he treated other people. It showed in the renewal of his work life. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean to work for the Lord and not for men? How can we find this renewing of our work, this recapturing of the work of the garden? Well, I think that there are 4 important things to remember, and that remembering them will have a transforming effect. First, and this is most important, remember that the work that you are assigned is ultimately God's work. Our jobs are our responsibilities entrusted to us by him. It's his world in which we work. It's his garden that we're tending. For this reason, our first point of reference in our work should be him and his standards. My predecessor would begin the academic year by taking a day out to pray systematically for each of the departments under his care and for the people within them by name. He understood that those people were people whom God loved, and that those departments could only flourish through his grace. The responsibility that he felt, he spoke about in terms of that passage from Jeremiah, when Jeremiah writes to the exiles in Babylon, "Remember, seek the welfare of the city I have sent you into exile. Pray for the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. So the sense of responsibility he had was a sense of responsibility shared with God. A sense of responsibility shared with the God who is ultimately responsible for the well-being of his creation. Remembering that the work was God's, that it should be held before God in prayer, and that it could not be achieved by means that dishonored God, gave his leadership an integrity and a wisdom that was universally respected. Well, each of us will face different challenges flowing from a recognition that our work is God's. For me, it's to guard my tongue. But each of us can begin to see how our work might be transformed if we begin by remembering that the work we undertake is ultimately his. Second, it's important to remember that we're God's servants in undertaking his work. In the commonly quoted tag, we're called to be servants and not sensations. When Donald took up the post that I then held, he was sent on a management course. As part of the course, they discussed different leadership styles. And when they came to talk about so-called servant leadership, the management guru passed quickly over the concept, explaining that it didn't really work. Donald set out during the next 5 years to prove her wrong. His fundamental attitude was that because he was God's servant, he should serve those with whom he worked. Remember that the parable of the sheep and the goats reminds us that it's in serving them that we serve him. This also made a recognizable difference to his work life. Because people knew that he came with the attitude of a servant, they trusted him, and he was more effective in his role. So because the work is God's, and because we're his servants in undertaking it, it's his approval in doing it that we should ultimately seek. Now that's extremely difficult. We're people made for relationship. We want the approval of those around us, and it's not prima facie wrong to do so. And in the work context, it's extremely important to know that we're respected. The approval of co-workers and of those to whom we report is something that we crave. But people are fickle, and doing our job well may sometimes involve putting them offside. If we simply set out to please them, there'll often be times when we're only poorly serving them. Moreover, we make ourselves hostages to their good opinions, and we burden ourselves with concern for their esteem. It is God to whom we ultimately report. It's him from whom we long to hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That's a very hard thing to remember. We're so ensnared by concern for our own good name. But it's only by focusing on the cross and on the love of a God who went to hell for us that we can understand our value and begin to give up our grasp on our own good name. In the Last Supper narrative in John, it says that Jesus was able to wash the disciples' feet. Why? He was able to wash the disciples' feet because he knew that he'd come from God and he was going to God. That's the security that we should in prayer develop. It's a security far less shifting than the changing opinions of those around us. Well, I myself have found this an enormous challenge. Over the last 5 years, I've been dealing with fundamental issues in the institutional life of the university. Issues around its financial sustainability, indeed its financial viability, and fundamental issues in its academic performance. We're a now much stronger institution. But dealing with those issues has not always made me popular. And it's been important to remember that the real question is how I perform in the eyes of an audience of one. It's not easy, and I can't say that I particularly do it well, but I can say that it can begin to set me free from the slavery of every passing opinion. Finally, just as we should remember that it's God's work that we undertake, that we're his servants in doing so, and that it's his approval that we should ultimately seek, so we should remember that it's from him and not from our work that we derive meaning and significance. I have many driven colleagues. It always used to make me feel slightly inadequate as a young academic that there were people in my faculty who believed in academic law in the way that a Christian believes in God. It was the organizing narrative of their life. And when such people retire, they're often faced with a great void because their purpose has been taken away. Well, it was a joy to watch the graciousness with which Donald retired from the job that I took over. He was a man who was moving from one set of tasks to which God had called him to another set of tasks in a different sphere. That was because he was not ultimately invested in his work, but in the God who gave him the work. This question of ultimate investment should control all sorts of decisions that we make about the relative importance of our work and the way we spend our time and energy. A friend of mine was once bemoaning the fact that 4 of his friends had received Nobel Prizes and he had not. When I asked whether he thought it was worth giving all that he'd have to give to academic science to achieve such a goal, he answered without hesitation that it was not. He told the story of one of his Nobel Prize-winning friends who'd warned him not to make the sacrifices that he had made, in particular in relation to his family, to achieve success. And those decisions face not only Nobel Prize winners. I have another friend who sells drains for a living, who tells of a boss whose life is entirely wrapped up in his work and who's already let it destroy relationships of great value. No job is worth our ultimate investment. To make it important to us is to repeat the idolatry of Adam and Eve. And part of the witness of a Christian at work is to signal the fact that work is not our ultimate calling, that our ultimate calling is to know God and to enjoy Him forever. So we have to remember that our work is God's. We have to remember that we're His servants, that we're called to be servants and not sensations. We have to remember that it's His approval that we ultimately seek, the approval of an audience of one. That it's His approval that we ultimately seek, and that our work is not something in which we can be ultimately invested. And that if it is, it will inevitably disappoint. They're the things we have to remember. And as I think about my 5 years in my current job, I realize how much I've fallen short of the model I've described. And I'm challenged by the call to work as if for the Lord. Crusaders works because of mentoring. And in Donald's life, I saw how this could work. And the challenge to me is to think how it might work for me in the here and now. May God give us grace to see our work lives redeemed in the call to work for Him. As we set out from breakfast to do whatever He'd have us do, let's recommit ourselves to do His work in His way. A great mentor is a challenging and dangerous thing. And for me, the question is whether I dare to accept the challenge that my mentor's life made so clear. And what of you? What of you as you go out to do whatever it is that you're paid or not paid to do today? How will you approach your work?